right, how's everybody doing today? Today is Thursday, February 6th, 2025. I hope everybody's doing all right. Didn't really go to work today because just haven't really felt like it. I've taken a lot of medication, so decided to get on here and kind of do a live with Medicine Head. So if you enjoy the hat, go look for it in the merchandise portion of the channel. My name is 12 Gauge, and this is my show, 12 Gauge Investigative. You know, one person who I really enjoy listening to their channel is The Interview Room with Chris McDonough. And he has another individual who I enjoy listening to as well. His name is Dr. Gary Bricado. Hopefully Gary and myself will get together and we'll be able to do a live stream together. Until then, we'll have to resort to doing these virtual lives with Gary and Chris. Anyway, this video is going to focus on the three reasons why the accused may have targeted the roommates. So I want you guys to really be open-minded as I react to this video. Once again, I want to thank Chris McDonough and Dr. Gary Bricado for this. And we will get started. Let's go ahead and start this.
So they wrote this book here. It's called The New Evil. And what it is understanding the emergence of modern violent crime. You can get it in the link below. Even as we're speaking, if you've not had a chance to read it, we would 100% encourage you to do that. So we want to thank, first of all of you who have come here this evening, and of course our subs, our Patreon members, our members here on YouTube. We are grateful to each and every one of you, and we cannot thank our mods enough for everything that you do for us here at the interview room. We believe we have the best mods out there. Teresa M., Maui Girl, Mimi J2, Miss Sophia, and of course, Laura Waldy. We are grateful to each and every one of you women for helping us get through this. So we ask one thing tonight and one thing always on the interview room is that you just hit the like button, hit the subscribe button if you wouldn't mind. It helps the channel grow, and that you share this on all of your media platforms that you have in your social networks. So this evening is dedicated to Kaylee, Madison, Xana, and Ethan, and their families. We appreciate every one of you being mindful of that in our chat. And of course, it's okay to have a different opinion, but please let's keep it respectful, and always remember that there's somebody at the other end potentially reading it, and it could be the family members. So we want to be conscientious of that. As we talk about Brian Kohlberger this evening, he is innocent until proven guilty in the court of law. He has a team of attorneys that represent him, and the state represents the families. So both sides of the coin we need to be mindful of. Now, that said, the things that are said here this evening are opinion and opinion only. And we are not talking about any one individual. We are talking about information and how the flow of that information, from my perspective as, criminal investigator, with starting this business back in 1982. So a couple of weekends now. And of course, from Dr. Bricado.
That's a horrific case, and my heart goes out, of course, to the victim of that case. But where I think it's relevant is that it shows that progression in cases like even this one that we're going to talk about.
Yep, absolutely. Hitless, thank you so much for being here, staying up till 2 a.m. in the morning. We are just humbled by that comment. And, we really appreciate you being with us this evening. All right. So the other day, I think we all saw on the news, we followed it in, the court. And let's always, one of the things that I always bear in mind is, remember, we don't investigate people per se. A good homicide detective investigates information.
I like that he said that because I heard that a while ago while I was researching this video. And I think that is very indicative of experience there. You know, Many times people think that certain people are targeted, profiled, or maliciously looked at, but just like he said, they don't investigate people, which is a great, great saying right there.
And where that information takes you is what you follow. And so I believe at this point, the other day, I had an epiphany again, and this was my own, where after the judge ruled on the death penalty on the table now for Brian Kohberger, and again, to reiterate, he's in custody allegedly for taking the lives of Kaylee, Madison, Xana, and Ethan. And almost immediately, I thought to myself, man, this judge just bought real estate in Brian Kohberger's head. Because the reason I say that is now that the death penalty's on the table, we're going to see a shifting, and we're already seeing it from the defense, and we're already seeing it with the Franks hearing coming up, and and I said this a long time ago. You can go back and watch; it's documented that they're going to try to shift it into, the officers, the DNA. They're going to attack all of the cell phone information, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All right. But they're not going to talk about Brian. They're not going to talk about the victims. Because, see, if they do that, then it becomes somewhat of a uphill potential climb. That said, if the idea has been, well, who's been the target in this particular case? And so I want to talk about three particular areas of understanding. One is the intensity of the attack. I will call it the surveillance observations that took place, and then the pre-incident behavior that occurred. And when did it start? When did that pre-incident behavior start? Taking into effect or into consideration, what are the various different theories that are going on in this case? We've heard about, and here this is a good example. Insufficient existence or insufferable existence, he is innocent. Okay? So this is the type of comment we love these kind of comments. Okay? You have every right to have that opinion, 100%. And as we do, right, to have a civil conversation about we're not going to talk about innocence or guilt tonight. That's for the jury to decide, as we saw. Okay. However, what I do want to talk about is the third piece of this is how far back is the prosecution going to be able to show that this guy went out there? And
That's an interesting point, Chris, that, you know, it's been detailed a lot lately as far as the psychological effects of this individual and, the creepiness and he wasn't good with women and he graded women harshly. But exactly how far back is the prosecution going to show when these types of behaviors, if they were real, ultimately started? And like I've always said, and I'm no criminologist or anything like that, but I work with a lot of pattern driven behaviors and thoughts. And in order to know where somebody is going, you have to kind of know where they've been. And you have to ask yourself, well, how did this start? Where did it become this way? How did it initiate to the point of the patterns adding up to the end result? Kind of like a timeline. They talk about the timeline of the murder, but they also, now that they have a suspect and the suspect had been in jail for 2 years, they've learned a lot about him, I'm sure. They've established a timeline of pattern behaviors, pattern tendencies, pattern positive and negative pertaining to this individual. They've done breakdowns of his life, I'm sure. Not only that doesn't mean that they've gone and spoken to people that knew him, because you can learn a lot about somebody by their digital footprints on the internet. And as we all know, he was very proficient with documenting his thoughts, his behaviors on certain websites. So I don't know if Chris is going to go into that level, but I thought I'd comment on that.
prepared for this. I would encourage anybody who's brand new to this channel to go back and look at the panel we put together before Brian Koberger was arrested, and listen very carefully to Dr. Bricato's assessment of who the perpetrator potentially what that perpetrator would look like from a behavioral aspect. And some of the things that have always stuck out with me when Gary went out there and told the public, and this was before they had arrested anyone, he had made some comments about, the emptiness inside of the person. He would probably be, et cetera, low in terms of personality type. He'd be, et cetera. And I started thinking about the survey. And Gary, what were some of the other thoughts that you had come up with, if you recall, the personality type that potentially the PD should be looking for?
So you're talking about when we had no information other than the crime scene situation,
Correct.
whatever was reported publicly, that is to say, and the knowledge that a knife was used and all of that. And what I had said at the time, because of my work in the mass murder world, is that no matter how you sliced, I mean, whether this was using the 4 victim definition or the 3 victim definition, this was a mass murder, right? So knowing what I do about mass murders, what I said was that when a mass murder is committed using anything other than a knife, statistically, I happen to know from my own work, the chances are greatly increased that what you're dealing with is a person who's going to have some interpersonal peculiarities. This is not just going to be some kind of psychopath or something, but this is going to be a person that's going to be considered by other people to
Like you said, some internal irreg- ill irregularities. Yeah.
be more weird or odd, in interpersonally. So that what I said was that this is probably going to be kind of a hot-headed, peculiar, paranoid kind of guy, a grudge-holding kind of a guy, who was going to probably be frustrated when relationships with other people could not be reduced to something of a science. That you couldn't, people were just too difficult to understand interpersonally. They're just
So that is huge right there. Think about that a minute. He said people are too difficult to understand. That he had to break them down to a science. It's a frustration to not be able to connect with people on a level that he would want to connect, which possibly could even bring out the quote unquote creepy behavior or very non sociable type behavior that people might view from him. Um, can you imagine being an individual that was not good with interaction with people? And I'm not talking about incels, and I'm not talking about those type people that struggle socially. I'm talking about individuals that where these are very specific that you can identify these patterns by psychologically looking at their movements, the way they articulate their words, their sentence structure, things like that. There's a science to all this. It isn't just looking at somebody whether they meet the mold of a mass killer, as Dr. Bricado stated, or they're wanting to profile somebody to fit the mold. The individual who commits the crime gives the investigators that mold to work with.
too complicated to navigate, and that he would have control issues. And then we talked about how the choice of the blade had a quality to it that was um, kind of very intimate and suggested somebody who perhaps wanted to get up close and personal with the victim, so that even though there was not an overt sexualized quality to it, that it was something worth thinking about, but that when there are those less overt sexualized qualities in people of this type, there is a proclivity for them to be driven more by an ego, a desire for infamy, a desire to insert oneself into the press, a desire to be a famous killer, a desire to, simply stick it to people through being smarter than them. So that what we also talked about was the expectation that this is somebody who might fiddle with the online stories about himself, or want people in a weird way to kind of know that he did it, or try to correct the narrative because it would bother this kind of person. For the
It's fascinating how an individual, past and present, and probably future, has that capability to want to live in infamy, to want to be famous to the extent that the only way that they can justify this feeling of being famous is by going and committing a crime. Because at that moment, especially this day and age, if it's heinous enough or if it's something that disrupts the natural flow of things, everybody knows about it within minutes. The moment he was arrested, it wasn't no time before his face was flashed all over the internet, and instantly he became famous. And I believe that whether he wanted that aspect to come out, it actually gave him purpose. Because most people know what anger feels like. I'm sure he understands anger and rage. I'm sure he understands self centeredness. So when you're all of a sudden thrust into the forelight of everybody knowing who you are, then all of a sudden you've achieved something that you set out to accomplish. Murdering the four, if he did it, was just extra.
The story to not be correct. So a lot of the things that we said there, if Brian Koberger is guilty, I think kind of eerily fit that description. I mean, almost to a T. But of course, we have to see, if he's guilty. But if he is, I think it was a really good example of how using statistics to profile can be very useful. We also said that, and this is going to be important, I think, for this conversation, is that the characteristics of whoever did this are a lot more like the characteristics of a serial killer than a mass murderer, right? Certainly not the mass murderer of the type that becomes interpersonally upset about something, feels there's been a loss to identity, gets emotionally overwhelmed, goes out and commits a mass murder. So this is very different. This seems to have more the qualities like we see in a serial killer, where a person might go out and get a weapon and have a fantasy of committing an offense for a long time, months, years, and then go out and try to.
I like how he uses that word fantasy, where somebody is preoccupied with that fantasy for a long time. It wasn't just a spur of the moment thing. They've thought about it. They've obsessed about it. They've rehearsed it. They've gone over the details over and over until it's time to pull it off.
Find somebody that fits the fantasy and then commit an offense in a way that sort of fits the fantasy. And we can talk a little bit about why we think that this is more that type of offense. But I think the facts are more suggestive of somebody that had fantasy first and then went out and cast the fantasy with a victim or victims, as opposed to the situation where you become fixated on a person and decide I have to go out and get a weapon and hurt them. So I'm proposing that the purchase of the knife, for example, would have been well in advance of identifying anybody that would have been killed. So I think we have to think about that too. Why is that important? Because, of course, if that is true, then the possibility of a jury freeing a person who may be at risk of doing that is a dangerous scenario. And we all agreed on that. Greg Cooper, Dean Jackson, Ann Burgess, myself, you, Chris, we all agreed that this had more the quality of what we would see in that kind of an offender, more like a serial offender. Do you still hold that view?
Yes, completely.
Yes. And as a consequence, I think we have to think about the build up. What would make a person of that type build up to an offense? What are the smaller offenses? Getting back to the case we mentioned earlier, the smaller offenses that might come in advance and be enough at first, and how fantasies start to get played out. And then, of course, the element of watching, how a person like that might survey a victim or watch them.
And with Lake and Riley's case,
Yeah.
Gary, would you agree? Just watching that guy, what really on video before, I think folks were saying before they saw that video, well, Lakin was the target, and we were questioning whether or not, once you see that video, you go, well, wait a minute,
Right.
She was the victim, but the target initially was the person inside of that apartment, where he spent over 2 hours almost surveilling that apartment. And that in of itself really, I think, showed the public and hopefully our audience, those that follow TIR, the depth and the commitment that these guys go through. And once they get in there, i.e., once it's in motion,
Right.
It's very difficult to stop it.
Well, you're saying something extremely important, Chris, but I think to people who do what you and I do, we get this, but I think we have to just flesh out briefly what you mean. Is that I think what you're saying is that when you have an offender that has decided today I'm going to go out and I'm going to enact my fantasy, I'm going to feed the wolf. Sometimes the person that you intend as your fantasy target doesn't work out. And then you wind up attacking other people just to feed the wolf, even though they may not be the ideal target in terms of what you had originally pictured. So some examples of that, you've spoken on this show many times about Matthew Checky and how Matthew Checky was unfortunately a victim of opportunity in a bathroom, killed by a man who had wanted to target someone else and was not fulfilled, was not successful in that, built it up with the fuel of pornography, and then went and killed this poor child. Another example of that on your show, we had Kathy Klein Rubin, who survived the Chi Omega house, the Bundy case. And she talked about how Bundy had tried to pick up a woman at a dance unsuccessfully. That was sort of the ideal victim in his mind. He felt rejected and he wound up looking for a place with an open door, went in and attacked all these women in the Chi Omega house in a
See, I agree with that, and I always thought of that in the beginning. I thought, this house, as much as they've said was targeted, I've always thought that if you were going to commit a crime like this, you would have multiple areas at your disposal. And people say, well, why didn't he commit this crime in Pullman? That's a good question, but wouldn't you be more apt to get caught if you committed the crime in your own neighborhood? So 10 miles away, even though it's not far, still far enough in your mind to go hunt something down because, as he always said, Moscow has better shopping over there. And I didn't ever always thought that was kind of a subliminal clue. Better shopping. Better shopping for what? You know, groceries, people. What was the shopping better over there for?
frenzy of misogynistic rage to compensate for the failure to connect with the victim earlier. So I think the point you're making is that sometimes the focus of the attack becomes looser, messier, more vague if the hyper focus on a fantasy victim doesn't go the way you plan. You could see this rapid expansion where you'll just sort of snatch out at a different person or whoever is around immediately or whatever. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, and where I think it's going to be a fascinating conversation tonight,
Yeah.
With our audience, to where, the other day when the judge ruled, hey, no, the death penalty is on the table. I think you and I would agree that that changes the dynamic internally for the suspect, right?
Yeah, we could have a long conversation about why, and we'll get to that part because you and I have discussed it. I think
Right.
we'll get to that as sort of the culmination of this conversation. But yes, I think it's a game changer.
Yeah, and so, and that leads me into, okay, then if he knows potentially, if he's the guy, ultimately, if the court and the jury says, yeah, he's the guy. Wait, I kind of had an epiphany, like I mentioned, and one of the first things for the audience that we would want to look for uh, as an investigator and from a criminal behavior analysis aspect is what is the initial contact point
Yes.
with the victims. All right. And so I stepped back just for a moment, and as you recall, as we were talking, I said to Gary, so everybody knows in pure transparency here, I said, everybody talks about either Maddie or Kaylee upstairs as being the primary target. And I think that comes from this idea that the chief initially in a press conference stepped up and said, hey, this looks like a targeted attack. And also that you had the coroner, not the medical examiner, but the coroner, okay, and they're different, come
Right.
out and say, yeah, this was a horrific, et cetera, et cetera. And I stepped back for a moment and I said to myself, well, there's no question that they were targeted. There's no question that both of them were targeted. But was his target set, and this is where where we're going to go tonight. And as you guys know out there, I value all opinions, but the man, I know what he's capable of. And so I bounced off of Gary. I said, Gary, what about the house? And what's his background? We know that he was a criminal, justice major. He's got his PhD, but who was he obsessed with in his studies? And I think we came to the conclusion and agreement. And can I tell him, Gary, who we were thinking?
Well, it's a hypothesis, but I think it's an interesting idea. I mean, this is what you've been thinking about, Chris. So
Right.
I think you lay it out, and I think the idea is you're asking me if I think it's plausible, essentially.
Right. Okay.
So what's your theory that you want?
Okay. So here was my theory. Is this his sorority moment, but it's not a sorority? And was he obsessed with Ted Bundy? And to the point where he's going to one-up him in his emotional development and thought process. And that comes from this idea of his pre-planning and all of the planning that may have been taking place. And the fact that Ted, had been out on the West Coast, Washington area, and then of course he attacks, young girls. And so I started thinking, well, wait a minute. Where is the contact point potentially for BK and the victims? And of course, we come back to the restaurant and his food picks, i.e., he's a vegetarian. And then we have two of the victims that worked at that restaurant. And this is not news to anybody. People have talked about this as well. And I thought to myself, that look, hey, if he's been studying these guys through all of these various different surveys, and I want to put a survey up here. And what I said to Dr. Bricado was, Gary, let's go through these questions again, and can we overlay them into his personality now post-incident of what he was building up to, and if he is the guy, do they overlap his survey? And look at some of these questions. He gives the respondent opportunity to get through an important action, emotion, and thought should thoroughly be detailed. So he's asking people that have committed serious crimes, tell me what you felt, tell me what you thought. Give me all those actions, emotions, give me everything you got. And look what the first question, or one of the first questions, number 13. How was your life right before the crime occurred? Okay. In your profile, the killer would have been somebody who's somewhat of an enigma. He's just weird, just out there. Women would tee off on him right away in terms of peg him like, this one's just like weird. Okay. And then look at.
So if we're looking at that question, how was your life before the crime occurred? How was his life before the crime occurred? We've learned that he was a TA. We've learned that he was going towards his PhD. We've learned that students had a hard time with him, especially females. We've even learned that supposedly there were some students that were keeping records of his behaviors and things that he would do in class. Was he approachable? Was he trying to interact with these questions in a way to kind of make this make sense in his mind, kind of like putting a puzzle piece together of something you've never done, but something you want to master?
14. Did you prepare for the crime before leaving your home? Please detail what you were thinking and feeling at this point.
I also believe that people don't take into account those two words because they have totally different meanings. Thinking and feeling. Usually the feeling comes before the thought, not the other way around. In his case, it seems like the thought came before the feeling because he was unable to attach to it. And as they're talking about that, that's quite interesting. The way he wrote these questions out. What were you thinking and what were you feeling? Usually someone has a feeling and then they have a thought associated with that feeling to go upon their next directive. So, did he prepare before he left his home? Did he incorporate somebody's thoughts and feelings about how it felt to get ready for the crime? Was there exhilaration? Was there doubt? Was there worry? Or was it a rush? Was there adrenaline? Was it an elation of the fruition of the fantasy finally being put in motion?
That's a really weird question when they say he left his house the night of this murder. Okay. And go ahead. Do you want to say something?
No, I just think, because it's very easy to miss the point, that what's being said here is that this is probably a person, whoever. Now, let's say we're talking about Koberger as a suspect. Well, if he's guilty, being the person who wrote this survey, what the collective information would tell us is that this is a person who was not only confused about the feelings that other people have, but confused about his own. So that what you would get is a person who would be interested in the phenomenology of emotional experience in social interactions and inside of oneself. Both of those things would be confusing to him. This is why it's not surprising that when we see his writings online, he talks about dissociation and numbness and so forth. In other words, this is the kind of person who would also be looking at himself like an alien, saying, I'm interested in what would be felt if one did such and such. And what you see in some people, for example, there are some serial killers that engage in torture that we think of them as 100% sadistic and enjoying it. But some of them do it out of a kind of intellectual stimulation and a kind of deadness and numbness, where it becomes, what do I need to do to a person to get them to feel something? And therefore, I'll feel something. It's like they're feeling dead inside. And how extreme does what I do to a person have to be for me to feel something? Because I feel dead.
And think about that on the aspect of this crime. We've heard that the injury didn't match, that there was a ferociousness toward one versus the other. If Maddie was killed first, then there would have been, if she didn't react in a sense of fear, or in a sense of defensiveness, or in a sense of, you know, overwhelming being scared and terrified, then the person inflicting that pain would have no attachment to it. So it would just be like a dud in their mind, I guess. It would be like, well, I was hoping to get some kind of feeling from you so that I could react to my fantasy and how it would feel great to actually kill somebody. There was no feeling according to her being killed so quickly. So he moved on to the next one, which was Kaylee. And according to her parents, she fought back. So there would have been fear. There would have been defensiveness. There would have been that feeling attachment. So the more that she fought, the more joy it brought the individual to actually be killing this person. More atonement to, I'm actually getting my fantasy replicated before my eyes, and I'm enjoying this. So the more that you're doing it, the more enjoyment you're getting due to the person's interaction, whether it be fear, whether it be scared, whether it be fighting for their lives.
Dead internally. And what you get is a person that you get the impression of a person that wants to understand the phenomenological emotional experience of people that are doing criminal things, almost as if to say, if I did that, would I feel alive? Or would I feel as numb and dead as I do now? That kind of thing. So every step of the way, what's enough to feel alive? Just looking, thinking about it, the planning, going, doing it, etc. So you really want to get it in here. Like you want to send it in here. And I imagine this being a person who wished that he could do that with other people. This is the kind of person that would almost wish that he could give a woman before a date a little card to fill out. Tell me what would be weird to do. Tell me what you would like. Tell me what you would find attractive. And by surveying you, I won't mess up because I'll have made a science out of it. But the problem is that's not how social interactions work. And when he tried to guess, he was lousy at it and weirded people out. And that's the whole thing. I think it's interesting, Chris, isn't it, to imagine a person who
So as he's saying this, the thought goes to my head. It's almost the person that has to experience the emotion in order to feel it because they have no understanding of what that feeling is. Lack of empathy, lack of attachment, lack of spontaneity. So supposedly he met two females at a pool party. Let's say that he's already been practicing before the pool party because he was invited to it. We can become chameleons in our environment. We can adapt. You know, you can watch a romantic movie and emulate certain scenes, gestures, funny jokes, whatever. And whenever you're on cue, it's almost like an actor. You're presenting this to not look awkward, to not look creepy, to look quote unquote normal. Maybe that was why he was able to receive two numbers, but there was no follow through, according to people that were in that environment. The girl supposedly had hang up calls, but no follow through. And you have to ask yourself, if you get two people's numbers, why don't you follow through and close the deal?
needs to reduce feelings to a science in order to understand them.
Yeah, and look at question number 15 for a minute, and I want to keep moving here, right?
Yeah.
How he asked the question, how did you travel to and enter the location that the crime occurred? Okay. So he wants to, he's got in this question, he's got the perpetrator in a car, potentially, or walking, or a bus, or whatever. But either way, he's got the perpetrator leaving the home, traveling to the location where the crime occurred. So in this questionnaire, he asked the folks, if you were to leave your house and travel to the location where you're going to commit this crime, I want your feelings about that. Because the next question is, after you arrive, what steps did you take prior to locating the victim or target, i.e. person or object? Please detail your thoughts and feelings. So it's almost like a transferred behavior, right? He's saying.
So once again, he's asking, after arriving, what step did you take prior to locating the victim or the target? Please detail your thoughts and your feelings. When he arrived, supposedly, making those circles around the apartment, parking, what step did he take to locating the victim or the target? Well, had to make sure the time was right. Had to make sure there was nobody out on that back balcony or that back patio like there usually was. People playing loud music and drinking on that couch or playing beer pong out in the backyard. He had to make sure everything was perfect. Had the fantasy in his mind. And then he had to react because he had to know previous times and observations of this quote unquote party house. What were the best times? When was the quietest time to slip in and do what you want to do and then leave without being seen? What was the quietest time in the neighborhood? When did people start to wind down? What kind of perimeter was around you? The one thing I don't understand is his ability to go in there with those lights on that back patio. Those lights were on, and that didn't stop him. The lights were on in the living room. That didn't stop him. His fantasy was going to be pulled off regardless of the minute inconveniences.
Saying, this isn't me. This is all about you. Okay. And here's number 17, where he goes, why did you choose the victim or target over others? So that's a plural. That's a plural concept. Others infers more than one. Okay. And so I read just a couple of those questions, and, I'm not going to, beat this thing to death in terms of, trying to understand, is there a correlation to this in any way, shape, or form? But now we go back to this idea of, okay, how far back were the authorities going to try to find the pre-planning? Okay, the pre-planning. And so I went back through the search warrants, and I started thinking about, okay, where did this knife thing come from? I.e. the sheath, where on the, the snap, they get DNA.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Before I go into that, that's his look when he stopped by the cops. Okay. While he was traveling home. All right. So this is the search warrant. these ASIN numbers are, as everybody knows, the ASIN numbers are just basically inventory control numbers for Amazon. Okay. But you'll notice here there are two ASIN numbers. And I started thinking to myself, all right, I'm going to put the first one in, which I did. And this is the Amazon ASIN that I put in on their website. And this is the product that came up. Okay. So I thought to myself, okay, well, what are the other search warrants saying?
So instantly I'm thinking, they say they don't have the knife, right? Everybody said they don't have the knife, they don't have the knife. But they have a sheath with this ASIN number. And as Chris is showing right here, you're able to see the knife in the knife sheath. So that tells you what kind of knife goes in the knife sheath. So even though you don't have the knife, you have potential x-rays on the cuts that the knife made. You have potential fragments that were left behind off this knife, potentially. You have the ability to see this knife before your eyes, knowing that this was a knife that was purchased. So just because you don't have the actual knife that committed the crime, you do have a part of the collaboration of the two items to go together. And I'm sure they're going to show this correlation in trial.
And the other search warrants started to chase the receipts to Amazon, to Walmart, and the banks. They started pushing search warrants out to the banks. And they were looking for a money trail that purchased potentially a weapon like this, because they had information that, because they discovered the sheath the day the girls were discovered, the victims were discovered, and they find this sheath on the bed upstairs next to Maddie and Kaylee. And now, but then I noticed on the search warrant, there was another ASIN number that they're looking for. And this was another K-bar knife, model number 1217S, as in Sam. So I thought to myself, is it possible? Is it possible that they're looking for two knives? Or did he?
That's interesting to me as well, because in one of my lives, I asked the question, could he have potentially had two knives? It would have been easier to leave the sheath of one knife if you had another knife sheath that you carried with you or had along for the ride. And possibly that's why the knife wound didn't match, because there were two different knives, two different styles. I asked these questions as well, and I'm not trying to take credit for anything either one of these gentlemen are saying. But if you go back into my lives, you'll see, especially the cases on IDAHO4, you will see that I've asked these questions before. Was there two knives? And people say, no, there's no way he would have taken two knives in there. Well, if I was doing this crime, I would have taken two knives. One breaks, one dulls, one gets lost along the fight. Then you're without a knife, you're without anything to defend yourself against somebody defending themselves against you killing them?
We have in possession 2 knives. And if so, because why would you have 2 different Amazon product numbers on the search warrant? And one with this style of knife and one that comes up to this particular model number. And so then I went back and I started looking for the distributor information that's in all the search warrants. And I find out that the distributor who sells basically wholesale product to somebody who sells through Amazon, and could be Amazon itself or Walmart or the company that they Blue Ridge Knives is a company that would send that information out on behalf of Amazon. Right? So we start chasing now the money trail, because that's what the investigators started to do. They started to chase the money trail. Okay. And so I thought to myself, okay, when was all this stuff taking place? When was this guy or person doing all of this? When did all this, start? And we start looking through some of the search warrants, and we discover that it started back in 2022. They go back to the companies and they say, look, we want information as far back as January forward. Okay. So, Gary, I want to stop for a moment because I don't want to get too far ahead of you. What are you thinking?
Well, I think what I recall was that I remember reading in Newsweek that back after Koberger was captured, that they were looking at things that went all the way back to March of 2022, and I think you found that it goes all the way back to January. And what's extremely important about that is that it would imply that if Koberger is guilty, that there was at least an impression that he would have purchased the weapon well before the crime. Now, if that is true, then the idea would be that this is fantasy based, that this is a person who would be thinking about committing these crimes well in advance. Now, that's more consistent, as we said, with what you see in serial offenders or people that have a fantasy, sexualized or not, that they're going to go out and commit a certain offense and it's going to be kind of perfect, and they dream it up and imagine doing it, and they sometimes get their tools well in advance and then go out and
here's that article that you're referring to.
Yes. You think it says March, right? March
30th, 2022. Right.
So they were looking at a 10-day window in March of 22. That's extremely important, because if it turns out that that is the window in which this might have been purchased, well, then look at how far in advance of the killings that would be. He probably didn't even know the victims yet, or have never encountered any of them, is what I'm saying, yet, if ever. So that, let's say we believe that he encounters 2 of them in the vegan restaurant, that's well in the future. So this is what I mean is a very big difference between a person who meets 2 people in a Greek restaurant, the Greek vegan restaurant, is imagining, taking their lives, fixated on them, whatever, and then goes out and gets a weapon and starts dreaming of doing it. This is more like, I want to kill someone.
Well, why is it so far fetched? Okay, let's say that these girls had Tinder accounts, or they had, Instagram, Snapchat, any of this stuff. Why is it so far fetched to think that Koberger or whoever did this, get the suspect in custody? Why is it so far fetched to think that he wouldn't be having a Tinder of his own, looking up potential dating prospects when he got to town? Why is it so far? Oh, goodness, excuse me. That came out of nowhere. I tried to pause it, but I didn't. Why is it so far fetched to think that he wouldn't be looking through these dating apps to find people in the area to potentially date or survey? You get what I'm saying? Like, or you get on Instagram. I know there's been numerous statements about he didn't have an Instagram, he didn't have any social media. But for the sake of just conversation, what if he did? You're going to look up the area and people around it, and you become fixated. And you visit somebody's Instagram, and you start to look at how they live their lives. Look at the lives that they live. How a lot of their pictures could have told you where they worked, where they lived, how their house looked. There's also things on those social medias of people you might know. You don't even have to know these people in order to stumble across their pages based on either knowing another person or knowing a person who knows this person who knows this person who knows this person. Do you get what I'm saying? Or if not in advance, when he got there. Who's to say that the Martinez guy didn't know somebody who knew Maddie, Kaylee, Vanna, or Ethan? Or the DJ that he talked to at the pool party? Who's to say he didn't know somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody who knew any of these four victims? You can find out a lot about people and their chain of who they're connected with very easily. Hell, half the time you don't even have to know their name. You can just download their picture, do a Google search, and it will tell you who these individuals are. And then you start connecting the dots. And you say, well, 12, you sound kind of creepy right now. Well, I've helped many females search for an individual that could have been cheating on them and who the female could have been. So I've watched them do it. Women are great at this. They are great at incorporating 6 degrees of separation. That's just my thought on that.
One. Well in advance, and then finds the target that seems to fit the fantasy, right? And when that happens, sometimes we can presume that they did indeed target the victim that they considered ideal for their particular prototype, right? As I talked about. Or it could just be that they wanted to target a certain person and couldn't, and they went out and found a substitute that was less ideal in fantasy terms. Or it could be that the person that they were targeting was targeted and other people were sort of just collaterally present who wound up being harmed. But the seeking of the knife well in advance, unless he was going to use it for something unrelated to murder, is very, very interesting that it would be
Well,
that far.
and when
Right.
you said that, that was one of the things that I was taking into consideration. I was thinking,
Right.
okay, then what's the target set here, right? What is the target set? I definitely believe that the girls, so I'm just going to say it, okay? I believe that all 5 of those girls in that house were the targets. The 2, Maddie and Kaylee, at the top floor, were his primaries, that he was fixated to get to the top and work his way down. And I just had this epiphany with, okay, what evidence is pointing me, and this is my opinion, okay, what evidence is pointing towards that as being a possibility? Okay. And we have talked in the past, even with Greg here and Ann and others, we all agreed there's a high probability that he had potentially been in that house, either as a Greg even said it on, I think, Dateline, where either, because it's a party house, they're probably, maybe some of the roommates are selling dope, et cetera. So there's a lot of traffic coming in and out of that potential house. Okay. So then when I started thinking about this, I started to think about, okay, well, then what are the possibilities? I mean, you have the theory of, the sorority or the Chi Mega or whatever they are, the kids, the boys, killing them. You have the Green Beret guy, the Army guy. Okay? You have the cops are covering up for, a dope transaction hit, et cetera. Okay? And that the two surviving victims and that, Xana's mom was involved in, criminal narcotics activity, et cetera. Okay. But we're not, if we take just the cartel type of thought process for a minute, okay? I've worked, as you know, cartel murders. Okay. They cut your head off and they put your head on a stick. They don't mess around with leaving people alive in the background. It just doesn't happen. Okay? They kill everybody. Okay. And so I thought, okay, I'm just going to put that one over here. I'm going to put that one over here and let the internet go crazy. Okay, which it has. Okay. And then the second one is the Green Beret. Okay. He's just going to target, certain people with inside the house, and then have a shootout with the cops, and it's all over, et cetera. The cops kill him, et cetera. Okay. I don't know. Okay. That's a 2 out of a 10. Okay. And then we go towards, okay, well, what took so long for the girls down on the first floor to call the cops? Well, if it's a dope house, they could be moving stuff in and out of that place. That's a no-brainer. All right. And the cops already know that because they've talked to them and said, what the heck took you so long? We just haven't heard that yet. Okay. That will come out in trial. Okay. But now we go to this guy who has come by that house 12 separate times. At least his phone has come by that house 12 separate times. And then we start connecting some of these other dots with his obsessions. And what are his obsessions?
Okay. We know that Koberger had at least hung out with an Asian friend, right? More than, he had a friend that had a house that got broken into. Um, he helped with the camera, this and that and the other. But let me ask you this question. What if those 12 times were not for surveillance purposes, but to give that friend a ride, or a friend of a friend of a friend, a ride to that place? Drop them off, pick them up, drop them off, pick them up. They were all going to get some weed, or they were going to just hang out, or maybe one of those girls knew those girls in that house. Because just because you don't go to the same university doesn't mean that you don't meet certain people that go to different universities and you become friends. Or he could have done it once and just became infatuated with something he saw. And then his fantasy started reoccurring again. And here we go. there's a tie to that house without what they've said is there's no attachment to these girls. Well, what are they supposed to say? What did the defense supposed to say? Yeah, my client knew these girls. My client knew these people. What are they supposed to say? You get what I'm saying? As I watched this, and I've watched it more than once, my mind is like, okay.
Sessions. Well, he likes to be what we would call a wannabe and interject himself into law enforcement, the realm of law enforcement. Okay. Yeah, this is the other theory. There you go. But young drug runners with possible LE involvement. Okay. I think the biggest, that's a great comment, but the biggest problem I'm having with that thought process is you also have to get the lab involved. You have to get all the IGG people involved. You have to get the FBI involved. You've got to get Dr. Picato and myself involved because we're thinking outside of the box, okay? And you got to throw us into the conspiracy, okay? That, it just, I don't know, it just doesn't line up for me. For some, it does, no problem. But remember, there were tunnels under the house too. And when the house was knocked down, the tunnels did not exist. And so we don't want to go down those rabbit holes. I want to stick with what the authorities did. And what they did was a couple of things that I think keep getting overlooked. And one of them is this right here. Okay, I'm going to show you right here. All right. So in one of the search warrants, they go and they file this search warrant on extreme network services. But whose information are they looking for? Kaylee's. This is her laptop. Okay. This is her laptop. The authorities file a search warrant to get information about her laptop. And here's the guy. You can barely read it, but the guy's name is Neil. Okay. Well, who is Neil? Well, Neil is a member of a task force for the United States Secret Service.
I love this part.
He is an intrusion expert. Meaning he's the kind of guy that can sit back and tell you from somebody's device, if somebody had the capability to hack into it and, quite frankly, take over the camera. Is this individual has the capability, i.e. the investigator, Neil, with the Secret Service, who has the capability to sit back and say, hey, this person potentially, if they have the skill, can sit behind a place, or if they are into the network, they could be at their house watching. Okay. And so we started thinking about that, and Gary and I started talking about it. We were like, Gary, does that fit this guy? That not him, but does that fit the personality type? And I think,
right.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, and I would submit to the thought process of Well, if you watch how the guy, his intensity in Lakin's case, if he would have had the capability and the intellect to set up a surveillance system of some sort, I believe he probably would have done that. And so I went back to some of my old video, and I want to play it real fast, of standing behind the house. This is the view of, this is where they believe he left and where they believe he may have parked. And I said this on Thanksgiving Day. That's when this was taken, you know, within a week or two after the homicides. As you can see, I'm behind the house, and right there is the balcony to the back. This area is very interesting from a geographic standpoint. I mean, this is the back side of the house here, and it comes up right up this little embankment here, but then it goes up into a really high hill. And we have a very difficult task because there's a chain link fence here as well for an individual to commit such a high profile situation and then flee up this area. You know, I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm saying I don't know if it's probable. Now, the point of entry, this would be very easy to get into this residence. So that was before Brian Koberger was ever arrested. Okay. And this, I was thinking, this is how the guy got into the house. Okay. But why was I thinking that? Well, I am, and this is where the other part that I want to go to, Gary, is this idea of the house as the primary. My feeling is the house was the primary target, i.e., if you want to catch a fox, you have to know where the den is. So think of the house as a den with fox inside of it. And the predator knows how many fox are in that house. And from this perch, he can see clearly from this geographically, from this part of the backyard area into actually, Maddie's room. If you look down here as well, it's a little icy still. But here's right the point we're missing. Dylan's room as well. Where everybody has been focusing on, well, yeah, you can see into Maddie's room because it's got her M and it's got her boots. But down on the bottom there is also one of the other girls' rooms. And I have felt from the beginning on there that cylinder, you'll see the and I'm pointing it to it, laying. There's a concrete block there. And these are some of the back rooms, bedrooms. It looks like the scene is frozen in time. It still just didn't see. It just didn't fit. They have it shut down with an officer here. Well, you can see that screen very clearly. There's the screen off. There's the concrete block. There's Maddie's room. But that's also one of the other girls' rooms down there at the bottom, below her room. Okay. It could be Bethany's. It could be Dylan's. Okay. And so I thought to myself, okay, and this just hit me the other day. Oh my gosh. Was he targeting the entire fox hole? Did he want everybody in that house? Thoughts, Gary?
Well, one of the things that I mentioned when we talk about this idea, you have that has always puzzled me about this case, and then you said that you thought it was an interesting point, is that I always thought that when we are subscribing to the idea that he may have had a specific target, went in after that target, and then somehow other people were just present and had to be eliminated because they were in the way or saw him or whatever. The problem with that is that the evidence suggests a person who was very carefully watching that house and knew everything about it inside and out. I think everything would have been a kind of surveillance for this person, including social media videos that showed the inside of the house, where where the dog might go, where the windows are, where people's rooms are, what things look like. Because this is somebody who, like I said, would have been studying like a science to obsessively be aware of as much as possible, like reconnaissance kind of situation. Who I think would have been very familiar with that yard and probably been in it. And so as a consequence, the question arises, well, if he was watching everything so carefully, why wouldn't he have just singled out the victim that he wanted when they were alone?
A great point. Exactly.
I mean, why, if you were that good at prepping, would you screw up and have all those people in there? So I think that there's two possibilities. One is what I have said before, is that I suspect, although we don't know this yet, may never, is that there might have been some mechanism of surveillance. And when the night came that it was time to go in and do this, when some event made him feel that it was necessary to go in, or it was time to go in, either an external factor or something emotional in himself. One is what I have said before, is that I suspect, although we don't know this yet, may never, is that there might have been some mechanism of surveillance. And when the night came that it was time to go in and do this, when some event made him feel that it was necessary to go in, or it was time to go in, either an external factor or something emotional in himself, he had to shut off the phone when approaching the house and would have probably lost touch with whatever that surveillance is. And in that little window of time, a whole bunch of things could have happened. People could have come home that weren't supposed to be there, blah, blah, blah. And that would answer the question. It would be that he thought there was going to be a certain arrangement that would give him privacy with the targeted victim. And then other people just popped in that little window when he's traveling there and the phone is off and he can't survey. The second possibility is that there was an interchangeableness of the women in the home, that it was really Ethan that was totally unexpected, but that he might have just thought he was going to go in there and just attack a whole bunch of women, and that was all all that was necessary.
A la Ted Bundy.
Well, like the Chi Omega situation, right? Where the idea would have been, well, I have examined this home and there are vulnerabilities that would make it easy, right? I could easily get in through this window, this door, or whatever, and these are women, and I want to kill women. That's possible too. And but so that then the idea would be that the only reason it would look like somebody was singled out is that person was the point of vulnerability through which one could look into the house using their laptop or their computer or their TV or whatever. But the idea is to look at everyone. I think those possibilities have to be kind of sorted out. But I think, to be honest, one cannot rule out your idea. It's just you're the first person saying it out loud. But I think that the truth is, if we're being logical, both of those have to be examined.
Well, and that's why I thought this aspect of this investigation, where they want to go, into Kaylee's stuff deep. So there has to be, like what we talked about was, what's the contact point for these victims, right? What is the contact point? And then I found, or I remember when the defense on January, and this is a report, remember when after Kohberger's in custody, his defense team, and after they had gone through his house and they collected all of this evidence here, all this stuff, okay, dog hair, possible dog hair, blood, for sure blood, because they tested it on the spot, and then other places they thought was consistent with that, and they sent it in. Okay, so they have all of this stuff, and we're not concentrating on this stuff because this is what was put in, the search warrant, but we don't know what the results of this stuff is yet. We don't have it back in the public arena of court of public opinion. Okay. However, what we do have is this. After that search warrant, Koberger gives them a letter authorizing them to go back into his apartment and pick up some items. Okay? Pick up some items. And look at the one item that they pick up. The defense removed a flat screen TV, a computer monitor, a small box of miscellaneous papers and receipts, a laundry basket that was full of books, and a medium-sized box. But they don't tell you what's in that medium-sized box. And so now I think to myself, okay.
Now that is interesting. I don't remember hearing about this or seeing this, but I remember hearing about the big screen TV. But why would he give them a letter to go pick this stuff up? What was on that TV? What was in that little or medium-sized box? Makes you wonder, right? Could he be hiding something in those items?
Because I know what the capabilities within inside of that smart TV are, and here they are. From a flat screen TV, forensics can potentially retrieve information like viewing history, i.e. channels watched, smart TV apps usage, web browsing history on the TV, connected devices, system settings, cache data from apps, photos, or videos stored on the TV, and even fingerprints on the screen, depending on the TV model and its operation systems. Essentially, any digital trace left behind by users' interaction with the smart TV. And now if we go to the girl that he set up the the cameras for, remember what her assessment was at the end? I think they took a statement where she's like, yeah, he offered to help me. Okay. He offered to assist. Okay. So he's the helper. And she was unaware that he potentially could have been streaming her every move in her house. And so why was this the items that he tells his defense team, go get? Go get the smart TV out of my house. I think that was an afterthought. And so why then, who was the helper, Gary? And when we hear Dylan say she believes she hears a male voice say something to the effect of, it's okay, I'm going to help you. Who else did that, Gary?
Well, there are a few offenders that we know of that use techniques like that. For example, you're talking about the incident that was discussed on Dateline where a woman living on campus, wanted some help from Brian with a break-in, which it's thought that he might have actually perpetrated. She became nervous about that, and then wanted help, and then he puts in like a camera to help her. But the theory is that perhaps the point was to break in, frighten her, get her to put a camera, and then he could manipulate the camera, being aware of the password, which was needed to install it, so that he could then watch her in her own homes. Well, so this idea of posing as a helper, first of all, with any kind of phishing scam or any kind of thing like that, you see that same quality of posing as something benign, like a Trojan horse. In fact, some of those viruses are even called Trojan horses, that you pose as something benign and then you reveal what you really are. Zodiac, for example, it is known in the case of Kathleen Johns, if she is a victim. Some people don't think she was, some people do. The idea was that Zodiac saw this woman driving with her infant on the road, and he called out to her that her tire was loose when it wasn't, and that he was going to help tighten the wheel. He, of course, loosened it so that a couple of seconds later, when she drives away, the tire goes rolling off, and then she has to get into his car to drive to a gas station. And then the idea is he tells her along the way that he's going to kill her. She jumps out of the vehicle with the baby, but he tells her that he's going to kill her. With Bundy, we have this kind of thing, but it's like slightly reversed. It's more like, can you please help me? Put my boat on top of the car. I'm helpless. My arm is in a sling. That kind of thing. And then the idea is that if you're kind to him, you get punished for being foolish enough to to think that you're punished for being kind and trusting someone, because he once upon a time trusted the woman that he was dating, who dumped him, which set everything off. The mother that was pretending to be a sister, and he was made a fool of. So the idea is to project that onto someone and say, oh, you're helping someone, you're a fool, that kind of thing. So we see both sides of it. We see helping as a you're an idiot who's kind to people, and we see it as, I'm the savior that's going to help you, but really I'm a wolf in sheep's clothing. And there are many, many offenders we could talk about who use these ruses. But what's interesting.
That makes so much sense, Dr. Mikado. It really does. That, he would interject himself as a helper, and therefore, instead of helping, ends up harming somebody. And that is just terrible, don't you think? That's just terrible. Well, I'm going to stop this with part one, and then I'll pick up part two. But I want you to see this. Let me see where it's at. Just like always, everything is hidden. Hold on a second. Here it is. Wasn't that something? I hope you enjoyed this. Until next time, keep yourself safe, and I'll see you soon.